let's start there. That's a great place to start. The French and the English and the Dutch and the Portuguese all were, as nations, somewhat envious of what happened to Spain. Spain was lucky in the sense that it stumbled upon two large, wealthy empires, and Spain was able to conquer those very rapidly and to loot them for the most part, sending gold and silver back to Spain, enslaving native peoples for mining and to a degree, for farming. They also were, of course, at the same time, the Spanish, even though they were looking for what a lot of writers refer to as plunder, okay? Spain was out to plunder. They also established what we might call a staple agricultural economy. And that in the long run turned out to be even more important than, looting the Inca and the Aztec empires. The staple was established in the Caribbean, and it was more of a continuation of something that had been going on for 50 years or so before Columbus, and that is the sugar plantation economy. The sugar plantation economy that utilized African slave labor. Now, first of all, we got to back up just a little bit and say, well, the first European power to really begin the plan and to really create a prototype plantation system was the Portuguese. And the Portuguese had been, of course, exploring south of the Iberian Peninsula down the African coast, trading with coastal peoples, for slaves, and gold and ivory and whatever else they could find. Now, slavery, in the sense that the Europeans were beginning to practice it in the 15th century, didn't have a whole lot of economic justification until a market for sugar became significant. And the first so-called sugar plantation islands were established on the various island chains, archipelagos, off the coast of Northwest Africa. And those would include the Madeira Islands, and the Canary Islands, and the Azores. All right? Azores and Madeira by the Portuguese, the Canary Islands colonized by the Spanish. Right? Now, in the case of the Canary Islands, there were actually indigenous peoples living on the Canary Islands, and the Spanish enslaved them. They didn't last very long, and so they lost their labor supply. And so the Portuguese began marketing African slaves captured or actually traded to the Portuguese along the West African coast. Where were these slaves coming from? They were, for the most part, war captives taken from the interior empires such as what would sometimes be called the Ghanaian Empire. But prior to the long-term European interaction with the West African coast, the more powerful tribes were the interior tribes. And they had largely subjugated the groups along the coast. Now, when the Portuguese began trading, and to some extent the Dutch later, the Portuguese started trading along the African coast. They had European trade goods that the coastal peoples could utilize. They also had superior armaments, weapons, that gave the coastal tribes an advantage over the interior tribes. And so what began was a destabilization of the West African population in terms of politics, in terms of warfare. Tribes along the coast who had been subjugated by the interior tribes were suddenly empowered by European traders. And as a result, they waged war against those interior peoples. And the interior peoples were the primary targets for the slave trade. They became those who were captured and taken back to the coastal areas where the coastal peoples interacting with the Portuguese had control. And then they would trade out, they would sell off those war captives. War captives were frequently, especially in this early period before the 19th century, war captives were frequently the targets for the slave trade. And that goes not just for Africans, but also for Native Americans, the indigenous peoples. So we'll see some examples of that when we get to the English colonization of the Carolinas. Anyway, so the Portuguese get a slave trade started, and the slave trade then enables the sugar island settlement to take place, and the extension after 1492, and for the most part after the early 1500s. During the early 1500s, that sugar island plantation system is simply replanted or extended to the Caribbean from the islands off the coast of Africa. And so the Caribbean islands, colonized by the Spanish, became the first plantation economies in the Western Hemisphere. They were the earliest settlements. And as I said earlier, the native peoples, as I think I said last time, the Arawaks and the Carib Indians who lived on the islands of the Caribbean were the first to be enslaved by the Spaniards. They did not last very long because of disease and the brutality of being enslaved for the sugar islands. And so what ensued was a replacement of those native slaves, indigenous slaves, for the African slaves. And so the movement of African peoples to the Western Hemisphere began in the late 16th century for the most part, as Spanish sugar islands became established in the Caribbean. Now later, the French and the British and the Dutch and even the Danes and a few others would establish their own colonies in the Caribbean. The Caribbean would become a very, very multinational region, but dominated by the Spanish in those areas that we've talked about. Hispaniola, with their first beachhead at Santo Domingo, and then later Cuba with their primary base at Havana. And then the capital of the region of New Spain in the Caribbean would essentially shift to Mexico City after the conquest of the Aztecs in 1519. So the movement of the slave trade was essentially part of the extension of the sugar plantation economy from the coastal islands of Africa to the Caribbean, primarily driven by the Spanish producing the sugar using slaves from Africa, which were generally traded by the Portuguese early on. Later, the Dutch would get into that as well. So that's kind of an early stage that we need to talk about. Not only were the Spanish looking for plunder, they established an agriculturally, you can call it a plantation economy, and that plantation economy became very, very lucrative because sugar was something that could only be produced in basically subtropical areas. There were a few places in North Africa, along coastal North Africa, where sugar had been produced all the way back to the Roman period, but that was very, very limited. So sugar was something that was produced originally in South Asia, and the Europeans were looking for a place to produce sugar themselves. So the Caribbean began to serve that, and then later Brazil for the Portuguese. So Brazil and the Caribbean became the outpost of the sugar plantation economy, and the slavery system, the slave labor system, followed that plantation system. Now, we started off talking about the French and the English. The French and the English envied primarily the plunder that the Spanish found in the New World. And that did certainly drive some of the early exploration. But just as important, perhaps, it depends on who you're reading, but perhaps just as important were several other drivers, several other impetuses, I guess. And among those would be the continued search for a passage to India, the continued search for a way to get to the Pacific coast of Asia, to Japan, China, and what would be referred to later as the East Indies, okay, basically what is today Indonesia and Malaysia, the Spice Islands. Those areas were still very much, and access to those areas in a way that was safe and more economically efficient was still a very important driver of exploration. And that whole idea is usually referred to as the search for a northwest passage. The search for a northwest passage. Now, exploration, as you know, the earliest exploration by Columbus, right, was sort of contract exploration, right? Remember Columbus? Columbus was a Genoese. He was an Italian mariner. Sailing, he wanted to sail for Portugal. Portugal wouldn't pay for it. Queen Isabella of Spain did. So Columbus is basically doing exploration for Spain, trying to find that passage to the Far East. And of course, he would have never done it had it not been for the misperceptions of the size of the Earth, right? Did we talk a little bit about that? So the Earth, is actually about 24,900 miles in circumference at the equator, but Columbus was working on a Ptolemy of Alexandria, ancient Greek scholar, geographer, who had actually overlooked an earlier estimation of the circumference of the Earth done by another Greek, Eratosthenes of Cyrene. Eratosthenes correctly estimated the circumference of the Earth long before Ptolemy, but it just seemed too big. The Earth couldn't be that big. And Ptolemy popularized a different idea that calculated the circumference of the Earth at only 9,000, the equivalent of about 9,000 miles. So that meant that if you calculated the size, the distance east-west that Marco Polo knew about to get to China, then it must be that the ocean sea was only a few thousand miles at the most to get to Asia. So that's Columbus's misperception that drove exploration. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. At least maybe not for a long time. Now, the Norse and the Vikings were exploring up into the north. We know that. They actually settled at a place off the coast. There are actually archaeological sites that document that there were Norse living in that area, but we don't know what happened to them, if they were assimilated with the native peoples or what. But their settlements didn't last past the year 1200 or so. So, just going back to the French and the English, they're becoming a bit envious of Spain. They want to find their own gold and riches and that sort of thing. This was particularly the case with the French monarch. And the French were actually in the game early on, as were the English, primarily through a primary sector economy, all right? Basically that fishing economy of the North Atlantic, all right? So I'm going to start talking about the French today, but I get to talk about one of my very favorite topics, and that's fishing, all right? So here's a slide, and one of the most important fisheries in the world that drove some of the early exploration by the French and to a degree the Portuguese and the Italians and the Basques, okay, were the cod fishery. The French cod fishery was generally a European-only activity. This was by the late 1400s, early 1500s, becoming a fairly lucrative market, because in the Catholic parts of Europe, which at this time most of it was still Catholic, right? In the Catholic parts of Europe, there was somewhat of a culturally based demand for fish, for cod in particular. And anyway, the cod fishery had been developing in the North Sea, in the Irish Sea, and essentially the areas close to Europe, in the northwest part of Europe. The cod fishery had gradually extended, kind of following that old exploration course of the Norse. And of course, Iceland had been colonized, and Greenland had been colonized. And so that area was fairly well known by fishermen, by the cod fishery in particular. Now, the thing about Columbus, Columbus is an Italian, right? And the information that Columbus and later Sebastian Cabot and John Cabot had access to, the Cabots were not from Genoa, they were from Venice, they were Venetians. So we've got the primary explorers of North America during the late 16th century, the late 15th century and early 16th century. They're Italians, okay? And they have the very best geographic information about the Northwest fisheries. But there was more information, there was more informal information about that North Atlantic fishery up in England and the northwestern coast of France, the area that we would today maybe call Brittany and Normandy. Brittany, Normandy, England, to a certain degree, northern Spain and northern Portugal, were all involved in the cod fishery. Okay, so these ports, particularly the ports in Brittany and Normandy, sent seafarers off into the North Atlantic all the time, and they didn't make a big deal out of it. They didn't advertise the fishery. All right, it makes sense, right? If you're a fisherman, you don't go tell everybody where you're catching everything. This was sort of secret information for this market. But it was significant in that it allowed the Northwest Europeans, the English, the Bretons, the Normans, the people in Normandy and Brittany, even the Irish as well, it allowed them a degree of expertise in the high seas in the North Atlantic. And there began to be rumors about other lands, about other islands, about the Vinland of Leif Erikson. Now, that information, of course, became even more important once the Spanish had begun to establish the sugar islands in the Caribbean. That passage to India, that northwest passage, was something that particularly the Cabots, sailing from Venice, out of Italy, up into the North Atlantic, but not for Spain, not for Portugal, for England. Right? The Cabots were doing exploration sort of on contract for England and for this idea of the Northwest Passage. There are both economic forces and sort of geopolitical forces that are beginning to take place and to take form. The reconquest of Spain, which had been going on for centuries against the Moorish, the Muslims of
of Spain. In 1492, the Spanish ended the conquest. They finalized the reconquest of Spain, forcing the Moors across Gibraltar and back to Africa, North Africa. So that military expansion was kind of continued on in the plantation economy into the Caribbean and the conquest of native peoples in the New World for plunder. Now, in addition to that seeking out of a western passage to India, well, first of all, what's the problem? Why can't they just go to the eastern route? They can't go the eastern route because of the rise of the Muslim Caliphate in the Middle East that put a damper on the movement of goods, that put a damper on commerce between Europe and China. It was an overland route. The old Silk Road route was well traversed, but it became more expensive and more dangerous to get to the Far East. So this maritime expansion was largely driven by a demand for more material goods in Europe. Now, back up just a little bit. Europeans were becoming, the demand for material goods from the Far East was beginning to grow, largely because there was this infusion of gold and silver into the European economies, into the Spanish and Portuguese economies, particularly the Spanish economy. The Spanish economy would then drive inflation in Europe. And I think I may have mentioned it last time, but or a time earlier, the Protestant parts of Europe, of north central Europe, began to benefit from this infusion of capital, of money, into the Spanish Empire, into Spain. And this began to drive investment, and at the same time, right about 1450 is when most economic historians, or and many other scholars, sociologists, it's when they really sort of say that capitalism really emerged. Capitalism in the sense of investing in, companies investing in venture capital sort of projects, emerges right about 1450, something like that, the middle part of the 1400s, before Columbus. But it's tied to the growth of sugar. It's tied to the infusion of capital from the New World through Spain. And so capitalism begins to take hold primarily in the Low Countries, the areas that we would call today the Netherlands and Belgium. So the Dutch are early to exploit this access to capital that the Spanish are bringing in. And they begin to finance activities like establishing plantation economies, establishing trade routes, that sort of thing. The English would largely follow from that. Okay? But the English are, until 1588, the English are, as you know, pretty much hemmed in by the Spanish. And those two naval rivalries between the English and the Spanish, of course, flip-flop after 1588 and the demise of the Spanish Armada. So the English began, through Queen Elizabeth, began to engage in what we might call sort of a parasitic relationship with the Spanish by through the process, or what we've come to call privateering, okay, piracy, but it's basically piracy that is sanctioned by the state. And essentially, Queen Elizabeth gave, a wink and a nod to people like Sir Francis Drake and others to capture Spanish gold-laden galleons, bring that capital back to England, and provide the crown, a cut of that. So even though it was a crime on the high seas, piracy was a crime, it was not enforced by England if it were done by English ships. So the Spanish ships became fair game to the English, and that sort of parasitic plundering of the plunderer was justified through things like religion, of course, because the Spanish were Catholics, and there's you've got something, you've got another little sort of moral excuse to take from the plunderers. So we've got plundering the plunderers. We've got a search for a Northwest Passage. That's really about it for a while. The problem is the French and a few others began to develop some geographic information about North America, and they just couldn't find very good reasons to establish colonies there. And so the answer to the question, what took them so long, is largely because they didn't have a heck of a lot of impetus. They didn't have a real strong reason to go. They wanted to find gold and riches, and that took a lot of Spanish explorers into North America. The French never found much of anything except the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and that became fairly significant. Now, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, however, was not. It was the land base for a fishery that had been evolving for decades, and that is the Grand Banks fishery. All right. So let's get back to fishing. The cod fishery was okay. Well, anyway, you know where Nova Scotia is? Labrador, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. Off the coast of Nova Scotia, as you go into the Atlantic a few hundred miles east of Nova Scotia, is a shallow area in the Atlantic, and it's an area known as the Grand Banks. And wherever you find the movement, right at that area on the Grand Banks, the depth of the ocean comes up from a couple of thousand feet up to just between 500 and 1,000 feet. Okay, so the ocean gets very shallow there. It's just a big part of the continental shelf. It's a huge, huge, vast area. And at that general position off the continent is where the Gulf Stream coming up from the north, or not so much the Gulf Stream, but warmer currents and sort of offshoots of the Gulf Stream. Warmer waters are moving northward, right where a polar ocean current moves south down the Canadian coast. And wherever you have cold ocean currents meeting warm ocean currents, you get and especially when there's a rise in the ocean floor, when the ocean gets ocean floor gets shallower, the ocean gets shallower. You have a phenomenon known as upwelling. Maybe you've heard of upwelling if you've taken a physical geography course. Upwelling moves water that has lots of mineral content, lots of nutrient content up into the shallows, up into the higher parts of the ocean, where it meets that warmer water and becomes more oxygenated. Plankton thrive in that sort of thing. So you had phytoplankton taken off, zooplankton feeding on the phytoplankton, and then small fish eating the plankton dwellers, and you have huge fisheries. And so most of the world's fisheries are in places where you have upwelling or where you have big bank areas. And there are a lot of other banks, but the Grand Banks was the one that's farthest out into the Atlantic. And by 1500, these cod fishermen from Northwest Europe, they know about this. They know about this area. They're attracted to this area. This allows information to go back about this coast of what is today, Canada, around the Maritimes of Canada. And the St. Lawrence, the Gulf of St. Lawrence then is eventually colonized first by a sort of the long-term fishery. So the fishery worked kind of like this. There were those fishermen who went out and actually caught cod, loaded them up, threw them in the hole just like we do today, and took them back to Europe and sold them as green cod. Not, there's just, I can't really say fresh because they didn't have refrigeration, but they were moving cod back and they would sell that. That wasn't where the money was. The money was in dried cod, because if you could stay in one area for a long period of time, catch cod, and then dry it and preserve it, then you could stay a very long time and develop a large cargo of highly valuable dried cod, actually salt cod, right? And salt cod to this day is on the menu in much of Western Europe. You may have even had it before. The way that it's a preserved form of fish, and basically you rehydrate it and cook it, and it's part of the staple diet back in this period. So anyway, the salt cod trade, or the dried salt cod trade, would be much more lucrative because you could bring a lot more home. This allowed fishing expeditions to go several months at a time, land on the coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, establish basically camps where they would bring young boys typically to work in these fish camps. And this is where you get this block cut, this actually fairly well-known block cut, which is in a number of historical geography texts. This was actually taken from the Ralph Brown book, which you have access to now. And basically it's showing the ship in the harbor. That's really just the sort of long-term transport in the supply ship. Most of the work is done in these smaller boats, and fishermen would go out in these smaller boats in the shallows of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and catch cod using hand lines, just one after the other. And cod is, cod is not the most beautiful fish, but it's a really, meaty fish, and it's very, very abundant. It was particularly abundant here. So they're catching fish like crazy. They haul them back to shore at the end of the day. There's a crew of young boys who, for the most part, have the job of cleaning the fish, hanging up the fish, salting them, and drying them out, basically doing the processing. All right? So you've got a land crew who does the processing. You've got the fishermen who do the work. You can see them laying out the cod here. And at the end of the season, after a couple of months, they would have enough cod to load a ship or two down, and they would all just take off and leave at the end of the fall, before the winter set in. This became a process that was so common that after a while, the native peoples kind of took notice. Who are these aliens that have landed on this shore? And it led to, as you might guess, going back to my handy notes, okay? It led to the emergence of a fur trade. The native people showed up and, of course, were interested in what's going on here. They weren't probably so interested in the cod, but they were interested in what these people from somewhere else had to trade with them. And the French very quickly realized that these Indians are fur trappers, and they have beaver pelts, and they have other things that we could sell on the way back. So you have the emergence of a fur trade in conjunction with the land cod fishery. Okay? So the very first French settlements were not intentionally fur trade settlements or fur outposts. They were They were fisheries, and this, of course, led to trade, interaction, spatial interaction between the indigenous peoples and these Frenchmen. Now, this was a slow process, okay? It's a slow process. Trade develops, and it's voluntary, okay? There's nobody busting anybody else over the head taking their furs, okay? Because after all, the French were the tiny, tiny minority, right? They had to cooperate, and probably, you can probably guess, the Indians were probably getting pretty good deals from these Europeans who knew they could get a really nice price for the beaver pelts back in Le Havre or St. Malo or someplace like that. And the Indians probably figured they were getting a fantastic deal because all they wanted was a bunch of beaver pelts. We can get those. I mean, we've got contacts way back in the Great Lakes that trade us beaver pelts for other stuff, you know. So this is a voluntary exchange, the way economies are supposed to operate. Right? Now let's talk a little bit about the labor that's involved. As I mentioned, we've got a transatlantic trading system. Furs are coming from not just the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but coming all the way from the Great Lakes area, because these Indians, the Algonquian groups who were trading initially in the St. Lawrence with the French, they have trade relationships with native peoples all over the place. They have good relationships with some, they have bad relationships with the other, okay? But they have certainly relationships with traders up near Hudson Bay, where the really good furs are coming from, you know? And those people need coastal stuff, so guess what? Once the Algonquians get access to these European trade goods, they become the people that everybody wants to trade with, because they've got these brass pots, they've got firearms, they've got beads, they've got manufactured, they've got mirrors, they have stuff that nobody's ever seen before, right? So the contact point in the Gulf of St. Lawrence is connecting an economy that's growing in Europe with an economy that's already existing in North America. And the French and the Algonquian Indians have this wonderful complementary trade relationship early on. Neither one of them is dominant over the other, except maybe the Indians are more dominant over the French. Okay? So, the fur trade that developed from the cod fishery depended on cooperation from native peoples, not just the locals that they're trading directly with, but the indirect locals. So peace often follows trade. Okay, it makes a lot more sense for people to get along if they're wanting to get rich than it does to conquer each other. Okay, so Native American labor is a necessity. They're the ones who trapped the animals, the fur bearers, processed the furs, made them last long so that they weren't going to spoil, and that made it into a durable commodity. Okay, now a durable commodity is something that can be traded without it deteriorating too much. So the dried cod, the salt cod, was more of a durable commodity than the green cod, okay, than the fresh stuff. Furs are even better. Furs are worth a heck of a lot more than dried fish, okay? So these furs go toward this European market, which then, of course, drives demand. Well, let's send some more people out there. Let's send some fur traders full-time to establish themselves, and that's what happens. Now we have to remember, we have to go back. What sort of society are these Frenchmen that might be fur traders coming from? They're coming from a society that is old and traditional, where the church has a pretty strong influence on everybody's lives, where there are taxes, where the monarch has a lot of power, perhaps. Maybe they're coming out of an economic system that we would know as feudalism, where there really weren't a lot of alternatives in life if you weren't a farmer. And if you were just a peasant farmer, then you would never own land, you would never really travel very much, you would never be rich, and you could be called up to go to war at any time, and just because of your social standing. The French were coming out of European society that had a lot less freedom than any Native American ever had. Okay? Personal freedom. And not only that, there were now capitalists in Holland, the Netherlands, that were willing to invest in operations that you could now participate in if you went into the New World. Now, the fur trade expanded up the St. Lawrence River, eventually leading to what we call the settlement of Canada. Canada along the St. Lawrence Valley. Today, you might refer to it as Main Street, Canada. So the market for the fur trade largely was Northern Europe, particularly in the Low Countries, where these capitalists were beginning to get started. Not so much in Spain. Okay. Now, the cod fishery and the French fur trade, or the fur trade, as I was trying to get to, were sort of emerging parts of this transatlantic economy that were emerging. And that's what got France established, right? And you can read Harlan Barrow's essay on Eastern North America as a fur trader's country as you get time. But let me move on with some more notes here, and don't worry about copying all this down. You'll have access to it. Now, I'm trying to get at the point of, the people who are the actors in this, the Native Americans and the Frenchmen who crossed the Atlantic to become fur traders in an alien place, a place that nobody really knew anything about. You had to think about who would do something like that. Well, the French were attracted to, of course, the fishery early on, then the fur trade, and because there was a growing number of people in the St. Lawrence Valley, this required some food products and some foodstuffs. So some agriculture kind of followed, but this was definitely not a land of good agriculture. It would never prove important that in terms of agricultural production. Now, just to look at some overall sort of patterns and to try to bring some of those out. The French in North America would largely be evicted in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War, the end of the French and Indian War. They would retain Louisiana, and by Louisiana I mean the Louisiana Purchase, right? As well as what is today the state of Louisiana and the Florida. Anyway, that area would remain fairly French, but in 1763 the French pretty much lost that empire, that possible North American empire, with the exception of some places that had French population that basically fell under British and American rule. Now, one of the things that we'll say, or you'll read about, is that even though France lost North America in 1763, it left its imprint in culture and language and landscape. And I'll show you some examples of how, all right? And it's still here, it's still with us. The French landscape signatures are still with us in a lot of ways. Now, the relationship between the French and the Native Americans is, in every case, everybody who writes about this gives it 2 thumbs up. It's a laudable relationship, better than any other group between Europe and Native Americans. The French are considered to be the one European group who got it right with the native peoples. Okay? And I guess you could probably try to explain that. Why would they? Well, the fur trade did not require, number one, there wasn't any good agricultural land, okay, in the St. Lawrence Valley. It did not attract agriculture. It did not attract plantation agriculture didn't attract slavery. It only attracted small numbers of people. Small numbers of people engaged in the fur trade and the fishery. Okay? And those small numbers of people were all men, right? Men were involved in the fur trade, not women, at least not European women. Lots of native women were. But it was Frenchmen. And the other side of this is that the fur trade was a dispersed activity. It required fur traders being out more or less by themselves all over the country, all into the interior, which necessitated cooperation with native peoples. The Frenchmen, the French fur trading men, who we often refer to as the coureurs de bois, right? Although I did hear one of my history professors once call it the coureur de bois, all right? The Oklahoma pronunciation. Coureurs de bois, the runners of the wood, or the fur traders. These men came from France. They discovered native cultures. They realized, they could make a pretty good living, but they had to learn the language, and they pretty much had to become part of these societies. But that wasn't so bad, because these societies were a heck of a lot freer than anything most Frenchmen understood. Did anybody have time to check out any of the film that I recommended? No? Okay. Well, one of the characters in Black Robe, the younger guy, he falls in love with this native woman on their trip up the river. And he's initially, okay, this is a younger guy that's traveling with the priest. And the younger guy, he's the woolly looking guy with long hair and raggedy clothes. He's a young fellow who I think was born in New France. And he talks to the priest. He's kind of like the guide for the priest. And he talks to the priest about maybe becoming a priest, right? But then after he learns, about the native peoples, heck with that, And he even becomes he kind of loses his Catholic beliefs at the end of the movie, and becomes, kind of part of the native group. So there were a lot of attractive things about native life to these Frenchmen. And they took Indian wives. They had Indian children. They basically assimilated or acculturated into the native system of the fur trade. They became important players within the system and influential. But they were largely assimilated more toward the Indians than necessarily loyal to their French culture. So the French-Indian relationship was generally cooperative. It was something that at the individual level was very, very remarkable. Small numbers of men intermarrying with native women, establishing a mixed blood population that would later become known as the Métis, and we'll talk more about them. But here are some other terms that I've already talked about. We've talked about cod. Another group, in addition to the Normans and the Bretons and the Irish and the English, were the Basques. The Basques are a very distinctive linguistic group of northeastern Spain and the Pyrenees Mountains of France. They were involved in the fishing trade too. They would also become important in the whaling industry much later. The Grand Banks are those areas. It's an international fishery off the coast of Nova Scotia, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and these are places I'm going to ask you to identify on a map. So if you're not familiar with them, we might have a look at some of the maps and the readings and that sort of thing. You know where those are. Again, this is where the fishermen contacted the Indians. The Indians began trading with them. The fur trade was initiated by, voluntarily by both sides because it benefited both sides. And the native peoples in the St. Lawrence Valley included linguistically Algonquian, okay? Now this included a tribe known as the Algonquins, all right? But also the Montagnais and the Nipissing. And then the other main group farther back into the interior, upriver, toward the eastern parts of the Great Lakes, toward Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, were Iroquoian linguistically, which included people known as the Iroquois Confederation, the Seneca, Cayuga, the Mohawks, Onondagas, etc. Those Iroquois groups were in control of the Great Lakes for the most part. They were not the allies of these Algonquians. The Huron were. The Huron and some of these other groups that were Iroquoian had good trade relationships with them. Okay? And we're going to come back to this dynamic between the Iroquois Confederation and the various Algonquin and other allies, Iroquoian allies later. In the film Black Robe, the priest is a Jesuit, Society of Jesus, and he's going to establish or actually relieve a mission that had been established among the Huron. Okay? The Huron were at war with the Iroquois, and the Iroquois had essentially wiped out the Huron. The Huron had also been hit hard by epidemic disease. Okay, so if we can kind of fast forward through the 16th century, the French were gradually establishing coastal settlements during the 1600s, and we have several relationships here. We have the interior Indians that brought the furs and took back European-produced goods to the interior. We have the French who were supplementing their fishing with fur trading, and we have some more or less paternal forces operating with the Catholic Church. You'll notice this if you watch that film. The church had a part in this, and maybe it had something to do with the good relationship between the French and the Indians. But the church did its best to prohibit the sale of alcohol to the French, to the Indians within their areas of the St. Lawrence Valley, and they did as much as they could to not allow firearms to move in large numbers. Okay, so this was an important facet. The French had a sort of a paternalistic view of native peoples. I'm talking about the French powers that be, and the church and the crown. They tried their best to make sure that they didn't upset the existing settlement pattern and economies of native peoples. The reason they did that was because they knew if they upset it, then they would lose the fur trade. They might lose the fur trade. So they did their best to manage it. Okay? Now, the alliances of the French were with the Algonquians and the Hurons, the Hurons and these Algonquian groups. And they wound up developing this fur trade, and guess what? In the early 1600s, the Dutch began to colonize the Hudson Valley. And guess what? The Dutch were interested in the fur trade, as were the Swedes who accompanied the Dutch. So we have a New Netherland in the Hudson Valley, with its capital at New Amsterdam, which today we call New York, okay, New York City. But basically the Hudson Valley and New York City were New Netherland, and across the river in New Jersey were the Swedes, okay? The Swedes colonized the Delaware Valley, Delaware Bay and Delaware Valley of New Jersey and Delaware and southeast Pennsylvania, mostly New Jersey. So the Swedes established themselves in New Jersey. They're fur traders, for sure. Now, the Dutch are cutting into the French market, right? The Dutch are really good at that. The Dutch are crafty folks. They come in, establish very good trade relationships with the Iroquois. The Iroquois Confederation has a, what do you call it, a sort of blood feud with these groups to the north, particularly the Huron, who are in control of some of this territory around the Great Lakes. So the Iroquois are itching to expand their territory. And when the Dutch show up, the Dutch don't have any qualms. Remember, the Dutch are Protestants. The Dutch are Protestants. The Dutch don't have any qualms whatsoever about trading whatever these Indians would like. They're real free traders, okay? So I guess what we could say is the French were more paternalistic. They're like the French today. They're trying to manage things. They're trying to control trade. You know, kind of like, unfortunately, we've switched over to having tariffs and quotas and all sorts of things to try to force our way into. Anyway, the French were more managerial about their trade relationships. The Dutch said, we're free traders, anything goes. We're liberals, okay? We're market liberals. That is, we'll trade whatever you want, okay? Now, the philosophy of market liberalism hadn't really developed yet. They were just there, okay? So the Dutch show up to the Iroquois. They say, here's all the alcohol you want. We're actually pretty good at making this stuff. And we have all the firearms that you ever wanted. So if you want to expand your fur trading territory to the north, you have our blessings, okay? The Iroquois took that as quite an opportunity, just like those coastal tribes in Africa took that as an opportunity to expand into the interior. Remember that? So the Iroquois expanded into the Great Lakes with plenty of firearms, plenty of firepower, and stronger trade relationships than really the French had access to. And so the Iroquois were allied with the Dutch and later the English on the Hudson River Valley. And the Dutch, of course, were in it for the business. They were not in it for making Catholics out of these native peoples. They were not concerned so much about long-term consequences. In fact, the Dutch would, of course, be kicked out in 1654, 1655, okay, by the English. But the Dutch were free traders. They got into the fur trade. They encouraged the Iroquois to expand to the north. They supplied them with firearms. They didn't send any Dutch missionaries, okay? Didn't do that. And then epidemic disease such as smallpox, influenza, began to hit the French and in the north. And in 1634 to 1639, something like 50% of the native peoples died to smallpox epidemic. This is actually noted in the film. By the time the priest arrives at the Huron mission, everybody had died, and the priest was I think the priest was almost dead. Anyway, that's the spoilers for you. Sorry about that. The Iroquois then, after the weakening of them, the Iroquois launched a genocidal war against all French allied Indians from 1647 to 1652, depopulating large areas of the Great Lakes, the area east of Lake Michigan and north of the Ohio River. This whole area became known as a completely disoriented region where lots of groups wound up leaving and moving into other areas as refugees. So people like the native peoples like the Delawares and the Shawnees and other groups wound up moving in with other native peoples in other parts of the eastern United States. So it was a real Shatterbelt area. So here we have the global economy and now ramifications of competition in the global economy. Just some maps. We need some maps here just so you can see this. Here's the St. Lawrence Valley. The French in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The French gradually moved upriver, which is this way, established Quebec. Later on, they established Montreal. And so this is the primary area we're talking about. Now, the native peoples are trading through here. So, and then the Hudson Valley is right here, okay? The Hudson Valley and the Iroquois, this is not the greatest depiction of where the Iroquois were, but the Dutch are down here for the most part, trading with the Iroquois. The Iroquois expand into this region, taking over once they have the firepower provided in the first half of the 1600s. In the first half of the 17th century is when you have the Iroquois expanding into this area at the expense of these Algonquian groups and other Iroquoian groups like the Huron. So this is Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. These are the lakes we're referring to. This is where this is the main area of Canadian population today, but it's the area where there was a lot of contested territory during the early half of the 1600s. Later on, the fur trade would extend all the way to, this is the later part of the 17th century. It would extend as far west as Illinois and the Dakotas, although this is referring to native peoples, the Lakota and the Dakota, and Minnesota. So Minnesota, the Dakotas were significant, and then all the way up to Hudson Bay. Now, this is the French system, and the French fur trade system is kind of shifting out now that the Iroquois are in control up here. So the French fur trade actually extends farther west after this trauma over here in the eastern Great Lakes. So that the French have outposts all over the place. The French have a really strong presence in Green Bay of Wisconsin, that area. They would even have settlements. They would even have settlements as far west and far afield as Oklahoma. Okay, and this is in the 17th century. Some of you may have heard of the archaeological site up here at Call Lake, outside of Newkirk and Ponca City, that area from Kay County, North Central Oklahoma. This is an archaeological site that's been studied by Stephen Perkins here at OSU, archaeologist. And this was, there's a lot of French trade elements that are found in that area. They're basically, French Métis traders. Later on, much later on, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the prominent families, this was after the French are out of the continent, prominent French families like the Choteaus. You ever heard of Choteau, Oklahoma? The Choteau family, who had been in North America for decades and decades, even though the French lost the territory, there were French individuals and families who still controlled a lot of the fur trade economy. And so the very earliest Europeans to settle in Oklahoma were the French. They were settled at fur trade posts to the north over near Ponca City, as well as places like Salina, Oklahoma, which is the longest continuously settled town in the state of Oklahoma. Salina was originally settled by one of the Choteau brothers, Auguste Choteau. And the Choteaus were allies of what Indian group in Oklahoma? Native people, indigenous to Oklahoma. Any idea?
Crows?
Osage. They were the Osage. They were allies of the Osages. Now, the Osages were occupying northeast Oklahoma, not the Cherokees. Okay, this is before the Cherokees. The Cherokees would wind up taking their land. Well, the Osages would lose their land to the federal government, who would then handed over to the Cherokees later. But it was the Osages who were the indigenous peoples of northeast Oklahoma. And they were part of that French network of fur trading. Okay, well, let's come back and we'll talk more about the settlement system within Canada, within French Canada next time. This is French Week.